Hello, I'm Barry Kemp. I'm speaking to you from our flat in Cairo, and I'm going to speak to you about the work that we've been doing fairly recently at the Great Aten Temple at Amana, a project for which we receive regular support from the Amana Research Foundation, for which myself and my colleagues are very, very grateful. We began the work at the Great Aten Temple in 2012, and since then we have pursued two rather separate lines of investigation. One of them is focused on the great stone building that once dominated the site. The whole site itself, including its great enclosure, is now called the Great Aten Temple, but its original ancient name was simply the House of the Aten. The Great Stone Temple, the Long Temple, because that's its shape, was first investigated in 1932 by the Egypt Exploration Society and its director John Pendlebury. And in the space of 1 month, he cleared the entire building from front to back. It was possible to do that because after the end of the Amana period itself, all of the stonework was very thoroughly removed. The temple was demolished and the stones taken away for use elsewhere. And what was left behind was a great spread of gypsum concrete on which were marked the outlines of the building. So although there's no standing stonework, if you study the foundations carefully enough, you can get a fairly detailed picture of the temple itself. And that is what we've been doing since we began in 2012, cleaning it again, making fresh plans, and something that Pendlebury himself didn't think of doing, starting to mark the outlines in fresh stones, in effect a very limited rebuilding. So that's one direction in which the work has gone. The other is to try to answer the question, why does this great stone temple stand in the middle of a huge enclosure which seems to contain little else apart from a stone sanctuary building at the back and a few smaller buildings of mud brick, including this rather complicated entrance on the north side? But what about the rest of the space where there doesn't appear to be, from the surface, much at all? Well, we've been investigating it bit by bit, and wherever we do some excavation, it turns out there are features there, although they don't fit into a very clear overall picture. But we'll start first at what we've been doing at the stone temple itself. When Pendlebury left the site, he left it open and sand drifted in and for the most part preserved the foundation layer. And here is part of the foundation layer that's just been exposed. It's made from a form of concrete which used gypsum instead of lime cement, and it was like a great white drawing board on which the architects put down the lines of offering tables and walls in ink or with lightly chiselled lines. And when the stones were removed after the end of the Amana period, much of it, although not all of it, but much of it remained and has preserved where most of the features were. And here it is exposed again, at least in a small part, and our artist and architect Juan Friedrichs from Argentina is making a fresh plan at the relatively large scale of 1 to 25. The old 1930s excavations planned at the scale of 1 to 100, which means there's not much space for fine detail, whereas at 1 to 25, 4 times the size of the scale, there's a lot of scope for putting in quite fine detail, and this helps us to understand better what the building looked like. Now we gradually advanced the work from the back of the temple on the east towards the front. When we started, we did quite a lot of work at the front, but most of the space in between, we're only now tackling season by season, strip by strip. And this is most of the strip that was freshly exposed in the most recent work, which started in September and ended at the beginning of November. And here you see a big area covered with little square, or almost square, rectangular shapes, each one of which was an offering table. There was a pathway that went right through the middle, and this now is left looking like a causeway, but this is misleading. Originally, the floor of the entire building was at this height here. That is actually an original paving stone, and so that marks how high above the foundations that the pavement was. And the more you go towards the west, the more you go towards the front, the deeper the foundations go, because the natural level of the desert dips a bit. And here's that same area seen from above. I should say that this is an ortho mosaic. It's made up from a very large number of individual photographs taken from a tiny camera suspended on the end of an angled pole. And it does the job that perhaps drone photographs might do, except that all these photographs are stitched together by clever software, by people who know what they're doing, and there are no distortions. It is an accurate topographic plan of the temple. And here you can see the main areas of offering tables. The gaps are where, after the stones had been taken away at the end of the Amana period, a further step in demolition took place when workmen came to hack up and remove the very foundation layer, but didn't complete the job at all. And the first thing they did was to hack their way along where walls had been. But they were, for some reason we don't understand, they were very reluctant to touch the offering table. So the offering table area has not been destroyed. And we have another area at the front where the same is true. And these three islands are where a single offering table stood in a room surrounded by walls, and the walls have been carefully removed, leaving the offering tables behind. Why did they do this? It just requires more and more study of the details to try and get the sequence which might take us into a better understanding of what was in the people's minds as they took this to us rather illogical way of destroying the temple. I mentioned that we have one, this is for us and also for Pendlebury, the one and only original paving stone still in position. Its location is here, and in the next picture, yes, here is Juan Friedrichs supporting it. It had toppled forwards a bit, but he's putting it back onto the area of gypsum concrete that it has come from, and it gives us the height and also the appearance of the floor. It's plainer than one might expect. It hasn't been chiseled absolutely flat. It's a little bit rough. Does this mean they put mats over it when the king was processing along this path? That's something we have to leave to our imaginations at the moment. It also, the chiseling of the top may also represent an attempt to smooth out irregularities. The whole floor stood not just on sand, but on sand and rubble, which had compressed slightly differently, and so it would have made the flooring slabs a bit uneven, and they could have compensated for that by dressing the surface, by chiseling the pieces of stone off to make sure it was more or less flat. The area we've been looking at, the area that was cleared and planned in the last autumn season, stands off to the right. And behind it is an area which had been cleared the season before and where our builders are now working away. We have a team of builders from the local village. They're headed by a family of three, a father and two sons. The father's not in this picture, but that's one of the sons, Ahab Shahata, and this is his brother Muhammad Shahata. Muhammad Shahata has really taken over the lead in the rebuilding. He's a very intuitive man who understands what we're doing, and it's very good for me, very happy about this, that I can leave him to take decisions and move the project forward. I don't have to hover over him all the time. And so here he is laying stones. You'll notice that there are two kinds of stone. There are small blocks which have been laid in Portland cement, which has a blackish colour or dark grey colour when it dries. So it's small stones in black cement up to a certain level, which is actually the ground level of the building at the time of Akhenaten. And at this point, at this level, each wall, each offering table is finished off with blocks of very fine limestone from quarries just outside Cairo at El Tora. And the blocks themselves are cut to the ancient preferred size, which are generally called talatat blocks. And here you can see talatat blocks laid over several of the offering tables. And in the background, the same is being done for the wall of, it was like a pylon which divided one of the spaces in the temple from the next one. Now, the Ministry of Antiquities doesn't like dark cement to be visible on an ancient site, and they have drawn my attention to this several times. And so this year, it was actually thanks to a suggestion by builder Muhammad Shahata. This time, when it's all finished, we don't have time to bury all of what we've done each year. When we leave in the past, we have left some of the exposed faces with evil black cement visible. And this doesn't look too good. And so this year, for the first time, we whitewashed the exposed surfaces. And that's visible in the next picture. Here we are. This is the day after the last day at work. We're standing at the back of the temple, looking along the axis from back to front. It's 200 meters. And in the distance, you can see the fringe of trees, which separates the desert from a narrow band of fields, and then comes the River Nile. So it isn't very far away. And you can see the nice white Jura limestone blocks, the sand that we've put in between the spaces to fill them up, but we haven't been able to do it completely. Over here, there wasn't time to get all the sand in. And so instead of having exposed blocks with naughty black cement, we've whitewashed it over so that it looks reasonably uniform. And when we resume, of course, these surfaces will in turn be buried. The rather odd grid that you can see here, this is the lower part of a much larger offering table. There were two of them, one here and one further to the to the west. And the tomb pictures themselves show that there were two much larger offering tables, more elaborate. We have lots of fragments of granite from the area. The biggest one is just visible there. And some of them show that they come from statues or other carved elements. And it seems that these two large offering tables were covered not with limestone, but with granite, which was sculpted in various forms, including statues. And this, of course, is a challenge for us. When the two offering tables, these larger ones, are completed up to ground level, I then want to meet this challenge by buying some slabs of granite to cover much of it. It'll be a token representation of the granite. We don't know what the shapes were like, and even if we did, we don't have the skills to carve granite, but it's a fair enough approximation in ideas that people should see. It's mostly limestone, but there were these two important elements of granite. And that's the looks like a causeway, but it's actually the line of the pavement, and that individual pavement block I showed you is buried in its own little shallow covering of sand here. And thanks to another one of our clever members of staff who's very good at working with multiple photographs and reassembling them in correct orthomosaic form. A set of the pictures taken from the end of the pole has here been put together into what seems to be an aerial photograph of the site on the last day of the work. This particular expert is Paul Doherty. I'll come back to him a bit later. So that's what we have been doing with the site of the Great Stone Temple. Still a long way to go, but I feel we're making good progress. In particular, at the end of this season, I felt we'd turned something of a corner. It was starting, what we have done is starting to look like the remains of a building rather than a rather confusing building site. The other part of the work, the other direction of research, is focused towards the back now. In various places within the enclosure, we have opened up, if you like, windows onto what's underneath the sand, and we have always found things. Mud brick offering tables, post holes from wooden constructions. And now we've turned our attention to the far rear of the temple, just behind the sanctuary building. We have an idea of what is there in a rather superficial way from vertical photographs we've taken in the past. This is one taken in 2012 from a helium balloon. You can see the rear wall of the temple. It was made of sun-dried mud bricks, adobe. It has never been excavated. The Pendlebury team left it alone. It would be a huge job to expose it. And having done that, you then have to protect it from the elements. But these photographs show one of its features. The wall is to some extent hollow. And it's hollow because at some point in the past, perhaps over a long period of time, local people have quarried the wall away. They have taken the bricks out for reuse, leaving the outside faces to some extent because they would have been damaged, and taking out the complete well-preserved bricks from the middle. And they've done it in a series of spaces, little elongated quarries. There's one here. But as I say, most of the wall has never been investigated by excavation. However, on his last day working on the site, Pendlebury put a little team of men into this area where it looked as though there was a gap that might indicate the presence of a doorway at the back of the temple, which lies on the temple axis. And so he excavated that, but barely reported on it. Here is the rear of the sanctuary building with spoil heaps from the 1930s. And notice you can see faintly this trench following a rectilinear course. Well, the excavations of the Pendlebury team, they re-cleared the sanctuary building completely. It had been looked at earlier. In fact, the first person to work here was Howard Carter, and revealed that there is a stone shrine terribly damaged now. It's in a really bad state. And then come the big spoil heaps, and then at the back a rectangle, part of a rectangle which appears to be a mud brick wall and a little mud brick base here. Now, in addition to a balloon photograph, in this last season, Paul Doherty, who specialises in photogrammetry, agreed to undertake a fresh survey of the entire enclosure. And he did this by having a little remote controlled camera mounted on the end of a telescopic pole, a real advance on the elongated clothes prop that we have been used. And over a period of more than 2 weeks, he walked on parallel paths backwards and forwards across the entire extent of the enclosure. He claims to have lost a few kilos in doing that. And at the end, he had accumulated several thousand photographs, which then have to be processed very slowly by his computer. And at the end, he produced a a topographic map of the entire temple enclosure, of which this is a sample. It's only a preliminary version. The full map has some raggedy black holes where the processing hasn't been yet properly completed. If you look carefully, you'll see that there are funny little looks as though it's rough sandpaper patches. This is where there are stones, and it's a result of little shadows. These need to be smoothed over. You can see that the map, or that the model, is coloured with false colours which represent height. So the pale brownish red colour signifies those parts which are higher. The green is the lowest level, and if one then walks to the right towards the front, gradually the green turns into blue. And in another stage that will come, the amount of detail that's been captured is so enormous. The whole surface can be given contours at a tiny difference in height. To put that in now would make it very confusing, but Paul hasn't yet completed that. And you can see at the back of the temple this shallow trench. And you can tell from the way it looks now, and this is also the case with the balloon photograph, that it has never been excavated. If it had been, there would be little spoil heaps all the way around it. And what has happened here, almost certainly, I've seen this at the Small Latin Temple, is it's a very shallow trench. If you brush it clear of the sand, you should find a very shallow layer of mud bricks. The wall has been demolished, probably leaving the foundation course, which tells you that this part of the building was not kept in use until the end. It has been demolished. It's an earlier phase. And so one of the aims of the excavation as it develops is to explore this chronological element. Now, the work that we've carried out in 2 seasons, 2021 and this year 2022, has been handled by a French archaeologist, Fabien Balestre. And here he is. He's a very careful, slow-working, methodical, meticulous man. He's an excellent archaeologist, and he's laid out an area. Last year he did the area which included the gateway, and I gave a lecture on that last year. That it's been filled in with sand to protect the area and to stop vehicles from driving over it, and he's exposed the area behind it. One thing to notice is how shallow the site is. You only have to brush away a few inches or centimetres of the sand, and there is the floor of the 18th dynasty. It may have eroded a bit, but it's basically an Amana period floor you're looking at. It's not the desert. It's actually a floor of mud that has been wetted more than once, perhaps from rain. And towards the bottom of the picture you can see drying cracks from where the surface has dried out. And there are 2 colours here. This represents, they're like islands of undisturbed mud that's dried out, and little shallow pathways that come through it. So this is one of the areas where Fabien worked, and what he's doing at the moment, he's clearing a hole containing pieces of pottery. This is the neck of a big funnel neck storage jar, and when we first saw it, we assumed that the rest of the jar was very deeply buried, but it turned out that all that is present of the pot is the neck, which has been held upright by a couple of stones and a large piece of pottery bowl. And it's almost certainly a jar stand, perhaps for an amphora, because amphorae and many other storage jars have pointed or rounded bases. They don't stand up on their own, they need a support, and this looks as though it is a support for a larger vessel. It is a jar stand. And that was here, that's right, in this corner here. Now, we decided at the beginning of the season that in addition to working in the area immediately beside the doorway, a separate area would be opened further in, when you walk over the surface, this doesn't show up on aerial photographs or these clever topographic plans. The surface is covered with quite small sherds, and the densest potsherds, that is, then the densest area is here, and so an area measuring 10 meters by 10 meters was laid out to explore why there's this concentration of sherds here. And this picture of that area shows even more starkly how close the ancient surface is to the modern surface. It is surprising it has survived, because it's regularly the route of farm animals being driven from one side of the temple to the other, and diagonally in recent years, perhaps going back to the 1950s or so, it's been crossed by wheeled transport, leaving tyre tracks, some of them almost certainly from lorries, and yet the sand, this thin layer of sand, cushions the desert underneath to some extent, and so the damage isn't as bad as you might expect. And you can see that this packed mud surface has been dug into by large numbers of roughly and sometimes quite carefully cut circular holes. Although they don't extend across the entire area, there's an area here that doesn't have them. And this raises the question, is this an area of one activity, and over here an area where the surface was being formed, but there was no incentive to cut holes into it? An expansion of the area will help us to understand that better. Now, this area also demanded some vertical pictures. Vertical pictures are of great help in archaeology, and this is our cheaper alternative way of doing it. One of our workmen, Walid Muhammad Omar, is holding this elongated clothes prop, in effect, with a tiny remote-controlled camera on the end, collecting large numbers of photographs, which may or may not be exactly vertical. It doesn't matter. Another person familiar with the manipulation of this kind of imagery is Dr. Anna Hodgkinson, and she worked on the photographs resulting from this exercise and produced this ortho mosaic with the help of Fabien himself, who's quite skilled in all the skills needed for archaeological fieldwork. And here's the vertical picture. It is orthographic. It is correct. It doesn't have to be, there's no distortion in the picture, so it's a perfect square. And you can see the division between the greater part of the area, which is busy with these cut pits in the surface, and the area at the top where it's been the surface has been left alone. You can't really say it's there's no obvious boundary here. They haven't put up a fence, but there's something has limited the freedom of people to make these cuttings, and so it's important now to extend the work to all sides, to try to make a pattern, a meaningful pattern out of the holes. Down here, you can't also be sure that it's random. There is some degree of order here, and again, you need a much bigger area to start forming conclusions. Now, the holes in this picture are all empty. They've been very carefully emptied and brushed to make a good picture. But when they were first exposed, they were filled with things. Mostly the things are broken potsherds, and you can see them here just starting to emerge as the surface layer of sand. The holes had got drift sand in, as if when the activity had been finished, people walked away and just left them for weathering. And here's a closer view of some of them with the sherds starting to appear. The sherds are quite clean. They've got clean breaks in particular, opening up the possibility of mending them, actually putting the sherds together to make complete pots. It'll take a lot of time to do that, though. Now, some of them also contained, these are not sherds, these are pieces of mud jar ceilings. Now, amphorae are tall vessels with a pointed base, two handles on the side, a fairly narrow neck. And that narrow neck, once the jar had been filled, was covered with mud, probably coming out of something that looked like a bucket, a small bucket. So it has nice smooth sides and an almost flat top. And before the mud dried, a wooden stamp was pressed onto the top and into the sides, giving information about either the contents or the institution that is behind it. These are our jar ceilings that have just been exposed. These have been cleaned a bit more. The pit has been cleaned a bit more, and here they are. One odd finding is that there are quite a lot of pieces of these mud jar ceilings, but the sherds from the vessels from which they come are quite rare. The fabric of amphorae is quite distinctive. It's a paler colour, it's a harder, better quality product. The bases are fairly pointed, almost indestructible. They have handles, so some of the sherds from amphorae, broken amphorae, are quite distinctive. And yet such sherds from amphorae are unusual, implying that once the caps, the mud caps, have been taken off and the contents poured out, if it's wine, then presumably it's happily drunk, and done in this area. This is unlikely to be a place just of disposal of material. The vessels were taken off somewhere else for reuse. They're nicely made vessels. They'd be ideal for carrying water. So this may explain why we have the seals from them, but not much evidence for the vessels themselves. And this is an example of one of the caps or ceilings, a wooden stamp with hieroglyphs carved into it has been pressed into the mud at the top and also on the sides. They mostly say they have the same words on. The hieroglyph here is for the word house, and the other hieroglyphs read the word Aten. Of course, there was more to it underneath. So this is the institution which has either provided the wine or which is intended to receive the wine, the house of the Aten. In other words, the great Aten temple. So that's fairly neat. This hole had contained some sherds, but when the sherds were cleaned out, it was found that it had been carefully plastered. It looks like a puddling pit of the kind that potters use, but there's no other evidence for pottery workshops, and it could be that this is just a better attempt to improve the appearance of a circular hole cut into the desert. And you can see the mud lining rises up the sides. In addition to pottery and jar ceilings, the ground contains small pieces of incense. This is not peculiar to this area. The entire temple enclosure here and there has produced incense. Incense, in fact, is common throughout Amana, even in the sandy, rubbly fill of smallish houses. The people of Amana were great incense users. It has ritual overtones. It's the material you present to the gods to make them happy. There's a famous text which actually says that. But it would also sweeten the air. It's what people find pleasure in sniffing incense now. The incense is partly composed of broken pieces. There's an obvious piece there. There's another one here. But a lot of it are very short lengths of little cylinders that look rather like vermicelli, spaghetti. And if you look carefully, you can see them. There's one there. And these are the result of pouring incense in a liquid or semi-liquid state through a sieve, almost certainly made of metal. We haven't found one. Metal is very rare on the site. They weren't pottery, but this is a process to refine the incense. And there are variations in colour as well, suggesting it's not all a uniform product. The incense, it's not an African species. It comes from the northeast Mediterranean. It's like, well, the industry survives as mastic. So they're using mastic on a big scale in the temple, including the area at the back. Now, an idea came to me, which we're going to try out, turn it around in our minds to see if it's really helpful or if it's just irrelevant. From tombs of the late 18th dynasty through into the 19th dynasty, so the period which spans across the Amana period, there are scenes like this. This is a particularly, perhaps the most detailed example. It comes from the Memphite tomb of General Horemheb, who eventually became pharaoh. He became King Horemheb. Before that, he had a rather grand tomb constructed for himself at Saqqara. He must have been based in Memphis. And one set of scenes shows moments in a grand funeral service. It involved probably temporary buildings. These things, which look like balloons or kites, they're rather simply rendered bunches of grapes with individual pieces of trailing vine coming underneath, and they're in little buildings which were perhaps temporary. These look like palm fronds coming out, and they contain offerings. These are offerings piled on offering stands. Amongst the offerings are pieces of slaughtered cattle. They have one of the, from our point of view, rather odd choices of the best cuts of meat is the complete head. So here the head is about to be cut off, and there's already one here. And in addition, there are large pottery vessels. These are not amphorae. They don't have the amphora shape with its pointed bottom and two handles. These are bigger pottery vessels, almost certainly to contain liquid and with mud caps over the top. And one is being taken out and then broken, and the liquid is pouring out. Is the liquid water? Or could it be beer? Unlikely to be wine, but water and beer are two most likely contents. And here's a group of them who've just been broken by a man who's expressing the agony of grief at the funeral service. Whilst over on the right, another man is holding a bowl which must contain incense, because he's throwing it onto another little bowl where incense is burning. And there's also a goose there, as well as a head cut from an ox. There are two here. Now, the breaking of the pots has a long history behind it, known more from texts. There are texts going back to the Old Kingdom of a ceremony of breaking the red pots. They don't explain why. You have to work that out for yourself. But it seems to be, at this period in particular, an important part of the funeral ceremony. Is that where all the broken sherds come from at the site at the back of the temple? I should say that our pottery expert, Pamela Rose, is a bit sceptical about this, but it requires careful further investigation. Firstly, to see to what extent the sherds we have were broken on the spot. But of course, that doesn't in the end tell you about the intention. In the end, most pots get broken. This is a deliberate breaking as part of a ceremony, the meaning of which is something else. It barely concerns us. The importance of thinking about this is that if this is the explanation for all our broken sherds, which have been gathered and buried in pits, they're not just left lying on the surface, is that it would help to confirm an idea that's been sort of rattling around for a while, that the huge enclosure with the temple in the middle is in fact a funerary enclosure there, not for the royal family, but for the people of the city who would come. And this is why there's so much space. The city had a lot of people. Is this the place where funerary ceremonies were held for whoever needed them? Such funerary ceremonies were not held in front of the rock tombs, or particularly not in front of the rock tombs. There's no trace of anything, not many 18th dynasty sherds either. There are lots of sherds there, but they belong to a much later period. So this is a question that now needs to be addressed. You think about these things and you see all the different kinds of evidence, and sometimes, if you're lucky or unusually clever, you come up with an answer that convinces your colleagues. And so, coming to the end, where are we? The excavation at the back will continue once we start up again. I'm in Cairo with Miriam, my wife. We have a permit from the Ministry of Antiquities to carry out a programme of work whenever we choose in 2023. Our permit lasts until the end of December, and the ministry has approved the details of what we want to do. But as with all foreign missions, we also have to have a security permit issued by the security police, and ours hasn't yet arrived. And this has been so for a lot of expeditions. It doesn't necessarily mean anything serious, merely that the process takes a long time. And fortunately, we have really quite a lot of time ahead of us, all the way until the end of December. And the process is unpredictable. At some point, we all hope, and amongst all of the inspectors, we're all hoping the same thing. Unannounced, our security permit will arrive at the ministry, because they do the application on our behalf, and then we set sail again, continuing the work of exploring the foundations of the big temple and rebuilding parts of it, and opening up further areas at the back of the temple completely. And that brings me to the end of my summary of what we've been up to, and it remains for me to say again, thank you very much for your donations and support. Now I will sign off, so I'll say goodbye.